asumir formalmente las competencias del Ejecutivo Nacional como el presidente encargado de Venezuela.
That was Juan Guaidó. Before that moment, he was a little-known congressperson in a sparsely populated district in Venezuela. Before that moment, more than 80% of Venezuelans didn't even know who he was. There, in that very moment, he declared himself President of Venezuela. What is happening? How is a situation like this even able to arise? Where is Venezuela been, and where is Venezuela going? It is all these issues and much more which I want to talk to you about on today's The Delta. So our discussion of Venezuela is really important to situate in historical context. Venezuela, for those who don't know, is a country at the very tip of Latin America with a very tumultuous history. I especially want to focus on the historical backdrop of Venezuela because the absence of this, I believe, crucially distorts important elements of the picture. In order to better situate ourselves, I'm going to be taking us through three pivotal phases. The first is just a brief glimmer into the back history of Venezuela before the rise of Hugo Chavez. The second, naturally, details the rise of Hugo Chavez himself, as well as some of the important achievements and accomplishments of his presidency and the social movement which he helped spawn, popularly known as the Bolivarian Revolution. Finally, I'm going to take us up to the present, which involves the rise of Nicolas Maduro, elected in 2013, and then later re-elected in 2017, as well as some of the more tumultuous events of the last couple of years, culminating in that. So the first thing that we need to recognize when we talk about Venezuela is the fact that the country is riven by incredible amounts of both poverty and inequality. One YouTuber who talks about this particularly eloquently is known as Mexi, and I highly recommend you check out her video. In it, she details the largely colonial history of Venezuela, as well as noting the fact that governmental policy in the country has produced not only class divisions that are very stark and worth noting, but also particularly prominent racialized divisions that has pitted a largely upper-middle-class white community in Venezuela attempting to emulate the standards of living of the West, with an overwhelmingly brown and mestizo poor population that has been, up until very recently, quite literally clinging to very survival. It's important to recognize this because the modern period of Venezuela comes into view with a very violent event, known as the Caracazo. In essence, a series of increasingly inept governments in Venezuela had been betting the entire pawnshop on trying to pull the economy out of poverty to the minimum extent required, while largely pilfering the profits of the state-owned oil enterprise for their own benefit. You see, while Venezuela had nationalized its oil industry, it was largely able to get on good relations with the United States because of the fact that the state-owned oil industry was basically treated as a private coffer for the very wealthy. This has historically meant that Venezuela has been one of the most unequal countries on the entire continent. The Caracazo, occurring in 1989, was the first definite attempt to break with that tradition. In it, as the name suggests, riots in Caracas responding to an IMF bailout demanding harsh austerity measures in which, and this is true, more than 50% of all of the budgetary surplus of the government was extracted for export for foreign investors, had utterly decimated the social livelihood of the population. The situation became so desperate, so wholly devoid of hope, that one army general by the name of Hugo Chavez attempted to initiate a coup simply to stop the violence and bloodshed. Violence and bloodshed which, to this day, the Venezuelan government denies the total death tolls, which would have been estimated by independent observers to have been anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000. Protesters looting either for very survival or for profit were simply shot dead in the street by security forces. Hugo Chavez was apprehended for his role in the Caracazo coup. However, when he was apprehended, he did two things that made him, in effect, a folk hero. First, he acknowledged Venezuela has a problem. Venezuela is not an organic community bound together by shared traditions, but is rather a horrendously and deeply divided society with ailing social problems in need of redress. Second, he did something none of the initiators of the Caracazo at the top would ever dare do. He claimed responsibility for his actions and said simply, "The time is not right." These actions were so inspiring to the vast majority of Venezuelans that after a brief stint in prison, he was pardoned. Not only that, in 1998, Hugo Chavez, previous coup leader, ran for president and won. Not only did he win, but his self-proclaimed Bolivarian revolution emphasized two things: participatory democracy and social welfare problems to help heal the very divisions he had originally diagnosed. This helped form the Fifth Bolivarian Republic and passed a constitution in 1999, which continues to this very day. Now, when Hugo Chavez first took power in 1999, he had a panoply of different problems, just a legion of things that needed to be addressed. Poverty rates routinely over 50%, and extreme poverty rates and illiteracy on the scale of the third world. His first task was to secure the means to be able to address these problems. Now, at first, Chavez was in a long line of Venezuelan generals cum leaders who had used populist rhetoric to gain power and then basically maintain the status quo. And as long as he did that, as long as rhetoric did not translate into action, the US federal government was going to be fine with the results. But it became increasingly clear in a series of high-profile addresses that Chavez made as he dismissed the previous executives of the state oil industry and implanted public officials with a direct prerogative to use the profits of the oil industry to fund his social welfare programs, that all was not going according to plan for Washington. As a result of this, a mere weeks later, members of the Venezuelan opposition collaborated with the US government in an attempt to overthrow Chavez, a dramatic and violent event known as the Carmonazo, after its chief architect, Pedro Carmona. So who exactly is Pedro Carmona? Really, getting a sense of who he was gives us a perfect picture as to the mindset of the Carmonazo. Carmona was a wealthy oligarch from the traditional old guard ruling elite within the country, with previous ties to previous administrations. He was also head of the Venezuelan Chamber of Commerce, and in addition to this, in what was infamously known as the Carmona Decree, he not only announced himself president and claimed falsely that Hugo Chavez had resigned, when he had in fact been captured and taken out of the country by military officials, he also announced the dissolution of the democratically elected National Assembly, Supreme Court, Comptroller General, and all democratically elected mayors, and the Attorney General, in effect deciding that he would rule by fiat for the indefinite future until elections would come in some other time. Now, as an understatement, the Western press got this completely wrong. Not only did they not challenge Carmona's claim to the presidency, but they also falsely circulated the very fictitious Chavez resignation letter that was later used to legitimate the transfer of power. Worse, the New York Times even went so far as to falsely declare Hugo Chavez a basic tyrant of the country, and also went along with the idea that so long as elections were held sometime in the future, all would be well and for the better without Hugo Chavez in charge of Venezuela. Luckily for the future of Venezuela, this was not to remain the situation. Within 48 hours, there were mass street protests and riots demanding the return of Chavez to power as democratically elected leader. As a result of this power internecine struggle between Chavez and his newfound administration and the largely white and upper-middle-class opposition parties, Chavez was to return not only to power, but to power with a mandate. And he would use this to profoundly transform Venezuela in ways that are enduring to the present day. You see, the problem is, in the conservative press, but even in the sometimes well-meaning liberal press, you run into two interrelated fallacies. The first on the conservative press is that Chavismo is nothing more than a demagogic, totalitarian concept which oppresses the Venezuelan people endlessly, a la the Soviet Union. In the liberal press, on the other hand, Chavismo had a few ideas, but in reality was nothing more than a rolling failure that was inevitably going to come to fruition. The reality is that neither of these depictions are true. On the one hand, Venezuela is one of the most democratic countries in the region, and this resists consistent propaganda on the part of the West. On the other hand, while Venezuela did run into some pretty significant challenges, as many countries struggling for modernity and for industrialization do, the reality remains that it's not just a well-meaning project, but something that has considerable successes and lessons for developing countries today that remains the legacy of Chavismo. But perhaps one of the most significant and instructive things to look at when understanding Chavez's administration are his various mission programs, like Robinson and Mercal. Robinson, for example, helped eradicate illiteracy, which was previously rampant in the country, and helped drastically increase the level of education amongst the Venezuelan population. Mercal, on the other hand, helped make food subsidies available to the country's large poor population and helped increase food security for more than 14 million Venezuelans. Other mission programs helped provide more than 2.5 million subsidized forms of housing and also produced a dramatic improvement in the standard of living in Venezuela. Now, there's often two major criticisms that are made of Chavez during this period of time. The first is that Chavez, in embracing socialism in whatever form he did, was inevitably leading the country towards collapse. Now, I genuinely wish I could be more sophisticated or nuanced with you about the story, but if you read the conservative press, that's really all that they have to say on the issue. Now, one, it's not really clear what they mean by socialism. If socialism just means doing things that generally help the population, then yes, Chavismo was an exercise in socialism, but it's not really clear why that was a bad thing. Eradicating illiteracy, helping improve the standard of living, educating the population, and helping to broaden the benefits of Venezuela's social resources was undoubtedly something that has provided enormous social benefits for the country. I mean, even today, the United Nations ranks Venezuela amongst developed nations because of the very social programs that Chavez helped introduce. The other major criticism that's made of Chavez basically tries to delink some of his successes with the background in which he operated. The major claim that's usually made is Venezuela, being a largely oil-dependent country, rises and falls with the oil price. And while that's to a certain extent true, it really doesn't do as much as is often alluded to explain the legacy of Chavez. Now, on the one hand, yes, Venezuela is disproportionately a petrostate, and has been reliant upon oil for a large degree of its own internal development programs. Indeed, the late 2000s saw insane increases in the price of oil, at one point topping off at almost $150 a barrel. On the other hand, it is simply empirically wrong to insist that because of this fact, Chavez was nothing interesting, and that the legacy that he helped produce was simply a product of rising and falling oil prices. It should be remembered that in the pre-Caracazo ages, Venezuela had also seen similar rises and falls in the price of oil, without any real corresponding rise in the standard of living for the vast majority of the Venezuelan population. What Chavez did in renationalizing the oil industry and turning government benefits towards increasing the standard of living for the poorest was turn social prosperity writ large into generalized prosperity for the vast majority of Venezuelans. Ultimately, Chavez occupies a position in the Venezuelan psyche that is roughly analogous to someone like Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States. He was elected 4 times, often with commanding margins that even Roosevelt couldn't match, including up to 60% of the vote in turnout that routinely saw over 70% of Venezuelans voting. For many Venezuelans, Chavez pointed the way to a more dignified standard of politics, one in which the vast majority of Venezuelans would be able to meaningfully participate for the first time. Not only that, the very policies that he helped produce enlivened civic activism and helped produce real, meaningful, decentralized participatory democracy. Now, the situation was by no means perfect. It should be recalled that Chavez was working in a very constrained and highly stratified society. Nonetheless, the achievements of Chavismo were remarkable by any standard, and Chavez deserves to be remembered for that. The fact that he built a legacy that in many ways remains in jeopardy today cannot entirely be held to be of his own fault. Nonetheless, Chavez, like all other leaders, was to eventually pass on, and in 2013, his handpicked successor, Nicolas Maduro, an otherwise unimpressive party man, was elected president on a razor-thin margin. Now, it's worthwhile to focus on the 2013 election for a number of reasons. Maduro won by a significantly smaller margin, and while Capriles, his rival, challenged the results, it was nonetheless confirmed that he had won by roughly 1.5%. For a sense of perspective, Chavez consistently won by over 10% of the vote. And here we fall into the next phase of the story, what was to become a massive economic crisis. The country's oil revenue was to dry up, as the price of oil fell to something like 1/3 of its value at the peak in the mid-2000s. As a result of this, and given the fact that Venezuela, according to the OECD, relies upon its oil exports for something like 98% of its hard currency reserves, it was inevitable that the country was going to go through shortfalls. But tellingly, per the nature of the administration, the reality remained that it still continued to spend something like 2/3 of all government expenditures, not on the military or the police, but on social services, the very basis of Chavismo. This takes us into the final stage, which will bring us up to the present, and hopefully I'll be able to convey to you just how significant a legacy is at stake, as well as how complex the issues on the ground remain. Maduro, recognizing that his support was rapidly dwindling, did something that would appear to scratch a few heads. When in doubt, he called an election. He called an election in advance of when he was required to. Now, remember, Maduro was originally elected democratically by roughly 50.5% of the vote in 2013. Under the Venezuelan constitution, he has a 6-year presidential term, meaning he should only really be coming up for election around now, namely at the literal time of the release of this video. Nonetheless, he called it early with the hopes of reconsolidating his control and being able to hold on to power, which, while it's never the greatest sign, is certainly something that you couldn't fault a politician for trying to do. When he called the election, it's worthwhile to note, he was faulted on a number of grounds. The first and most significant one was that a number of opposition leaders had been banned from participating, and other parties had been harassed. This is certainly to the demerit of both Maduro and the PSUV. But the reality remains that some of those opposition parties had simply failed to turn out to elections, and on the other hand, certain opposition leaders, most prominently amongst them Leopoldo Lopez, who was considered a rival in the opposition to Maduro, had literally been participating in violent guerimbas in which more than 200 citizens had been killed. Now, I know that it sometimes seems like I'm being glib or editorializing, but it really is worth pausing and stressing here. Can you imagine a politician in any country who is credibly accused of starting riots in which more than 200 die, attempting to run for president without challenge? Furthermore, a president with a previous criminal conviction record of both corruption at the highest level as well as embezzlement of funds for personal use. This is the side of Leopoldo Lopez that was noted in a prominent Lovato story in Foreign Policy back in 2016 that is rarely discussed. So it's a much more complicated question than is often discussed. But the reality remains that Maduro was running for re-election, trying to consolidate control, recognizing that his popularity was ebbing. Not the greatest, but certainly understandable under the circumstances. So if you're in the opposition, what do you do this? You have a few opposition leaders who have been sidelined, but you have other prominent candidates, as a prominent Nakhla article at the time noted, who could have both run and probably beaten Maduro at this period in time. I mean, there really is no denying this. Maduro's popularity was sliding with the general population. Broad support for Chavismo existed, but Maduro in particular was beginning to waver in the popular imagination. So you clearly run the most powerful candidate you have, you consolidate all of your resources around them, and you kick out the PSUV, right? That's basic tactics. But nope, you don't do that. Instead, if you're the opposition, and by no means for the first time, especially since the period after Chavez returned from the coup that you really wish he had seen himself out on, no, you boycott these elections. You insist the entire process is fraudulent, and you're swiftly echoed by the United States and the European Union, and you insist that no election, so long as the PSUV remains in power, is legitimate. Now, you can call that a lot of things. But when the Carter Center, which had monitored no less than 4 elections over that period of time, calls Venezuelan elections, a rapidly developing but still very much developing country, the best in the world, no, you don't get to claim that elections wholesale are fraudulent. Now, forgive me, but when I think of fraud, I think of something very particular. I think of ballot stuffing. I think of outright intimidation. I think of murder of the political opposition. None of these things were occurring in any of the elections in question. So when the opposition banned the 2017 presidential election, in many ways they showed their colors for what was to come. Most tellingly, when one person broke ranks with them, Henry Falcone, recognizing as the polling was telling them that he had a pretty good chance of beating Maduro, much as they had a pretty good chance of beating Maduro back in 2013, you wouldn't expect the opposition to call him a traitor and an accomplice of the government, and yet do that they did. The opposition exhibits many tendencies, but an understanding of basic democratic norms is clearly not one of them. Which begs the question, why do it? Why boycott yet another election? Why throw it all out, recognizing that if and when, as he did, Maduro wins the 2017 presidential election, which you will call fraudulent, even though no less than 4 international monitoring groups, none of whom you wanted in the country at the time, confirmed the legitimacy of the election. Why do you do it? Why do you enshrine the opposition president in power until 2023? We're back at the present. Juan Guaido is why. Because if you ran in a presidential election in 2017 and you lost despite throwing all of your energies behind it, if you even put out the risk that that could occur, then the whole narrative that has defined U.S.-Venezuelan relations since January 22nd, 2019, when Guaido swore himself into office, well, that all comes crumbling down. What you want is for Maduro to run unopposed, because that legitimates the narrative that Venezuela does not have democratic elections. It legitimates your longer-standing grievance that it has never had democratic elections, and it therefore makes seem all the more plausible that in a country with no democratic elections and with no accountable popular representation, hey, why not you? Why not the Venezuelan opposition, which has lost more than 20 of the last 25 popular referenda and elections since Chavez was initially sent into power in 1998? That is the reality of this situation. The opposition needed to be absent in order to be at the table now, in order to legitimate regime change. Now, as I've mentioned a number of times, Maduro has his flaws. His packing of the courts, while understandable from a partisan angle, can contribute to polarization. His management of the oil crisis after the mid-2000s peak, and his failure to save a rainy day fund for when those prices inevitably came down, definitely a flaw. His repression of political dissidents, definitely a flaw. Allegations, which are still developing, of extrajudicial executions, definitely a flaw. But the reality remains. A country has the right to self-determination. The reality remains that since 1998, the population of Venezuela has consistently and credibly, and often very understandably, chosen the Bolivarian Revolution, has chosen the PSUV, Chavez, and Maduro as their democratically elected leaders. And a number of times, the opposition has quite literally chosen not even to show up at the polls. This is the crucial legacy within which Guaido, who proclaims freedom and democracy for all Venezuelans, must be understood. A man who is virtually unknown by the general population who claims to speak for them. That is the dangerous precedent that is being set here. And for all of the flaws and failures of the Maduro administration, the reality remains it is a fundamental tenet of international law that if a democracy is to be functioning, it must be a democracy which is chosen by right, by its own people, and not by might, by us. So after hearing all this, one might well wonder, what's the upshot? What's the story? What's the pitch? The reality is very simple. Regime change is bad. Regime change has been bad. Regime change is bad. And by and large, regime change will always be bad. To the record of anyone who insists the contrary, one can point to Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. The list really goes on. And the death toll is in the millions. So to those who insist that I'm on the side of autocracy, on the side of, again, a democratically elected leader who had the luck of having an opposition that didn't believe in elections, I plead guilty. Maduro is the elected leader of Venezuela, for all of the good, the bad, and the ugly that means. Because in saying that, what I'm really saying is that it was their choice and not ours. When we preach democracy and freedom to Venezuelans, we can't give them poverty and sanctions and war. We can't ram aid across the border at the express reservation of the Venezuelan government. We can't preach that they must accept a token $20 million in aid while we seize control of their state oil enterprises and deliver them into the hands of a man who has never once run for president, but wants you to believe he already is president. And if the narrative seems that smooth, if it almost seems like you've heard it before, it's because I guarantee you, if you've opened a history book, you've heard this story before. The reality remains, it's not history. This is now. What are you going to do about it? Hey guys, so if you liked the video, we're a pretty new channel, if it isn't already obvious by the lack of surrounding videos. Hopefully that's just a relic of the past. But welcome to the Delta. I'm Adam. If you've got any feedback or friendly comments on this, I'm more than happy to read in the sections. If you do like what you see, we hope to produce more of it, hopefully informed by all of your thoughtful comments and criticism. So feel free to smash that like and subscribe button, and also follow us on Twitter.